Daniel Reeves had been a journalist long enough to know when a story was being handed to him for the wrong reasons. It wasn't that the assignment itself was bad. On paper, profiling Clint Eastwood sounded like a dream gig. But the way his editor had pitched it over coffee that morning left a sour taste in his mouth. "We need something sharp," she'd said, stirring her latte with a little too much force. "Not another love letter. People are tired of legends who never get questioned." He knew what she meant. Eastwood had become one of those rare figures who seemed carved from granite, untouchable, unchanging, always standing in the same quiet pose whether he was accepting an Oscar or giving a speech at a film festival. At 94, he still directed movies, still showed up on set before sunrise, still wore the same kind of boots he'd worn in Rawhide. To some, that was admirable. To others, it was suspicious. How could anyone stay that consistent in a world that shifted every 5 minutes? Daniel used to be one of the admirers. He remembered watching Unforgiven as a teenager, stunned by how quietly it dismantled the myth of the Western hero. Later, he'd studied Million Dollar Baby in film school, moved by its raw, unflinching look at dignity and choice. Back then, Eastwood wasn't just a movie star. He was a storyteller who trusted his audience to sit with discomfort, to think for themselves. But somewhere along the way, the admiration had cooled. Maybe it was the political speeches or the interviews where Eastwood spoke in riddles that felt more like evasions than wisdom. Or maybe it was just time. Heroes always shrink when you get older. Still, he took the assignment. Not because he wanted to tear Eastwood down, but because he needed to understand what had changed. Eastwood, or him. Over the next week, Daniel buried himself in research. He rewatched old interviews, scanned decades of press coverage, and dug into message boards where fans and critics argued in endless loops. He found quotes that seemed contradictory. One day Eastwood praising individual freedom, the next quietly supporting a local homeless shelter. He read about on-set tensions, about actors who felt pushed too hard, and others who called him the most generous collaborator they'd ever worked with. The more he looked, the less clear the picture became. That should have been a sign. Instead, it fueled his suspicion. Maybe the truth was that there was no single truth, just a carefully managed image. He drafted a list of questions that bordered on confrontational. Do you ever worry your views are out of step with today's audiences? How do you respond to critics who say your recent films romanticize a past that never existed? Is it possible to be both a legend and out of touch? He didn't want to ambush Eastwood. He told himself that. But he did want to see if the man behind the myth could hold up under scrutiny. His editor approved the angle. Finally, she said, someone's going to ask the hard questions. The interview was set for a Thursday afternoon in Carmel. Eastwood rarely gave press access these days, but something about Daniel's pitch. Maybe the mention of Unforgiven, maybe just the fact that he didn't ask for photos, had gotten a quiet yes. Daniel booked a flight, packed a single suitcase, and tried not to think about how strange it felt to be chasing a ghost he used to believe in. The morning of the flight, he stood in his kitchen staring at a framed photo on the wall, him at 22, holding a film festival ticket with Mystic River playing in the background. He remembered how he'd walked out of that screening feeling like the world made a little more sense. Now he wasn't sure what he believed anymore. Was Eastwood still saying something worth hearing? Or had he become a relic, repeating the same lines while the world moved on? Carmel was smaller than he expected. No paparazzi, no fan clusters, just quiet streets lined with cypress trees and the constant hush of ocean wind. Eastwood's house sat on a bluff overlooking the water, unassuming except for the view. There was no gate, no assistant waiting at the door, just a wooden bench on the porch and a pair of well-worn work boots by the step. When Eastwood opened the door, he was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, his hair silver but thick, his handshake firm but not showy. He offered coffee, no small talk. They sat outside, the Pacific stretching endlessly in front of them, waves breaking in slow rhythm. Daniel set up his recorder, cleared his throat, and began with what he thought was a gentle opener. You've been telling stories for over 60 years. What keeps you coming back? Eastwood took a sip of coffee. Same thing that got me started, he said. Curiosity. It wasn't the answer Daniel expected. He'd prepared for defensiveness, for pride, maybe even a little nostalgia. But this was something else, simple, almost humble. He scrambled to adjust, steering toward the sharper questions he'd rehearsed. He brought up a recent film that critics had called tone deaf. He mentioned a comment Eastwood made years ago about kids these days that had gone viral for all the wrong reasons. Eastwood listened, didn't interrupt, didn't frown, just sat there, eyes steady, like he was giving each word its proper weight before deciding what to do with it. Daniel pressed on. Do you ever feel like people don't really see you? That they only see the version they want to believe? For the first time, Eastwood smiled, a small, knowing thing. Happens to everyone, he said. Even journalists. The remark caught Daniel off guard. Not because it was cutting, but because it was true. He realized with a jolt that he'd come here not to understand Eastwood, but to confirm a story he'd already written in his head. And Eastwood somehow saw it, but he didn't call him out. Didn't get angry. Just leaned back in his chair, gazed at the horizon, and waited. Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what came next. The sun had dipped lower by the time the first real silence settled between them. It wasn't awkward, just full. The kind of quiet that happens when two people stop performing and start listening. Daniel shifted in his chair, suddenly aware of how loudly his own thoughts had been shouting all morning. He'd come prepared with angles, quotes, and counterpoints, but none of it felt useful now. Eastwood hadn't raised his voice once, hadn't dodged a question, hadn't even seemed bothered by the edge in Daniel's tone, and that, more than anything, threw him off. He glanced at his recorder. The red light was still on. Good. But part of him wondered if any of this would translate. How do you capture the weight of a pause? The way someone's eyes hold your question like it's worth considering, not just answering. You mentioned curiosity, Daniel said finally, choosing his words more carefully this time. What are you curious about now? Eastwood looked out toward the water. A pelican skimmed the surface, wings wide and steady. People, he said after a moment. Always people. What makes them tick? What they're willing to stand for. What they'll walk away from. It sounded simple, almost cliché, but the way he said it, low, unhurried, made it feel like something he'd tested over decades, not just repeated. Daniel thought about his own work. Lately, it felt less like curiosity and more like hunting. Find the flaw. Expose the gap between image and reality. But what if the reality was just complicated? What if the man in front of him wasn't hiding anything at all? He tried another angle. You've worked with actors half your age, sometimes a third. Do they ever treat you like a museum piece? Like you're just there for the legend? A dry chuckle. Sometimes. But most of them just want to do good work. That hasn't changed. He paused. You ever notice how people assume old folks don't see what's going on? Like we're just waiting out the clock? No, we see plenty. Maybe more, because we've stopped pretending. Daniel felt that one in his chest. He thought of his own father, now in his late 70s, who'd stopped reading the news because everyone's shouting, no one's talking. Was that what Eastwood meant? That clarity came not from having all the answers, but from stepping back from the noise. He took a breath. There's this idea out there that your films lately feel disconnected from the world we live in now, like you're making movies for a different time. Eastwood didn't flinch. Maybe I am. Or maybe the world's forgotten how to sit with silence, how to let a character breathe before they explain themselves. He turned slightly, meeting Daniel's eyes. You ever watch a movie and feel like it's yelling at you? Like it doesn't trust you to figure it out on your own? Daniel nodded. He had. Too many times. That's not how I work, Eastwood said. Never was. I figure if you're paying attention, you'll get it. If you're not, no amount of dialogue's gonna help. It was the closest he'd come to defending himself, and even then it wasn't defensive. It was just a statement of belief. Daniel realized he'd been waiting for Eastwood to justify his relevance, to prove he still mattered. But the man didn't seem interested in proving anything. He just was. The wind picked up, rustling the eucalyptus trees behind the house. Somewhere down the coast, a foghorn sounded low and mournful. Daniel glanced at his notes, but the questions he'd written now felt forced, even childish. Who was he to decide what stories Eastwood should tell at this point in his life? The man had earned the right to make whatever he wanted, whether critics liked it or not. Still, one thing nagged at him. An old interview clip had resurfaced online a few months back. Eastwood making a comment about personal responsibility during a panel discussion. Taken out of context, it sounded cold, almost dismissive of systemic problems. It had sparked a wave of backlash, with young filmmakers calling him out of touch. Daniel had included it in his research file with a red highlight. He hesitated, then asked, "That panel a few years ago, You said something about responsibility. A lot of people took it as if you were saying people just need to pull themselves up, no matter their circumstances. Eastwood was quiet for a long time, not avoiding the question, just letting it settle. When he spoke, his voice was softer but no less sure. I believe in responsibility, he said. Mine, yours, everybody's, but I never said it was the only thing that matters. You can't talk about responsibility without talking about chance. Luck, timing. Who gave you a hand when you were down? He looked at Daniel. I've had plenty of help in my life. Never forgot that. It was the first time Daniel felt like he was hearing something real. Not a soundbite, not a performance, but a lived truth. And it didn't fit the narrative he'd built. He thought about his own career. How many times had he gotten a break because someone took a chance on him? How many editors had pushed his work forward when it wasn't perfect? He'd always called it hard work, but now he wondered how much of it was just being in the right place at the right time, with the right person willing to listen. The sun was nearly gone now, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. Eastwood stood slowly, not because he was frail, just deliberate. You hungry? He asked. Daniel blinked. Sure. They walked inside. The house was modest. Wood floors, bookshelves crammed with paperbacks, a piano in the corner with sheet music stacked on top. No awards on display. No framed posters of Dirty Harry or Gran Torino. Just a home. Eastwood made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. Simple, old-fashioned comfort food. They ate at a small kitchen table, the kind you'd find in any house, not a celebrity's. For a while, they didn't talk about movies or interviews or legacies. They talked about the weather, the local diner that still served pie at 2 a.m., the way the fog rolled in faster these days. And in that ordinary moment, Daniel felt something shift inside him. He wasn't sitting across from a myth anymore. He was sharing soup with a man who'd lived a long, full life and who didn't seem interested in being remembered as anything other than human. When it was time to go, Eastwood walked him to the door. You'll write what you see, he said, not as a request but as a quiet acknowledgement. Daniel nodded. I'll try. As he drove back toward town, the recorder sat silent in his bag. He wasn't sure what he'd write yet, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to have all the answers before he started. The drive back to his hotel felt longer than it should have. The recorder sat in Daniel's bag like a stone, silent, heavy with everything it hadn't captured. He kept replaying the conversation in his head, not the quotes or the sound bites, but the spaces between them. The way Eastwood had looked at him when he asked about that old panel comment, not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with something closer to patience. Like he'd heard that question before, and knew it came from a place of confusion, not malice. Back in his room, Daniel poured himself a glass of water and sat on the edge of the bed. He opened his laptop, stared at the blank document titled Eastwood Profile, Final Draft, and felt completely stuck. The sharp, skeptical tone he'd planned felt wrong now, forced, like wearing someone else's clothes. He'd gone in expecting to dissect a legend, but what he'd found was just a person, flawed, thoughtful, stubborn in the quiet way old trees are stubborn, rooted deep even when the wind howls. He pulled out his notebook and flipped through his scribbles. Most of it was useless now, but one line stood out underlined twice. You ever watch a movie and feel like it's yelling at you? That had stayed with him. It wasn't just about filmmaking. It was about how people talk to each other these days. Everyone shouting to be heard, no one listening to understand. Including him. He opened a new document. No title this time. Just started typing what he remembered, not as a journalist, but as someone who'd been surprised. The next morning he called his editor. I need another day, he said. There's more to this, she sounded skeptical. More? I thought you had the interview. I did, but I think I was asking the wrong questions. A pause. Then fine, but don't go soft on me. We didn't send you to write a tribute. I'm not, he said, and he meant it. He spent the day walking, along the beach, through the quiet streets of Carmel, past bookstores and coffee shops where no one recognized him, let alone Eastwood. He thought about legacy, not the kind carved into plaques or listed on Wikipedia, but the kind that lives in the people you've touched. He remembered something Eastwood had said offhand while washing dishes. I've fired people. Hired 'em too. Made mistakes with both. It wasn't dramatic, but it was honest. And honesty, Daniel realized, was becoming rare. That afternoon, he returned to Eastwood's house. He hadn't been invited back, but something told him it was okay to knock. Eastwood answered the door in the same flannel shirt, like he hadn't moved since yesterday. No surprise in his eyes, just a slight nod as if he'd been expecting this. "Mind if I sit a while?" Daniel asked. "Coffee's hot." They sat on the porch again. No recorders this time. Just two men in the late afternoon light. Daniel didn't start with a question. He just said, "I think I came here trying to prove you were out of touch. But I'm the one who's been looking through the wrong lens." Eastwood poured coffee into 2 mugs. "Happens," he said. "I saw your films as relics," Daniel continued. "But they're not. They're just slower. They ask you to lean in, not scroll past." Eastwood sipped his coffee. Not everything needs to be loud to matter. That's when Daniel asked the question he'd been circling since the beginning, the one that tied everything together. He leaned forward, voice low but urgent. "Years ago in that interview, you said something about how people don't take responsibility anymore. Then last year, in Cry Macho, you showed a broken man finding grace through caring for someone else. Which one is the real you? The skeptic or the believer?" The wind stilled. Even the gulls seemed to hush. Eastwood set his mug down, looked at Daniel not with frustration, but with a kind of weary clarity, like he'd carried this balance his whole life and finally someone was asking about the weight of it. Then he said, "Just once, just one sentence, I've never met a person who didn't deserve a second look. That was it. No flourish. No explanation. Just those 10 words spoken like they were as plain as the sky above them, but they hit Daniel like a wave. He forgot to breathe for a second. Forgot his notes, his angle, his editor's expectations. All he could think was, that's it. That's the whole thing, 'cause it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about being old-fashioned or modern. It was about seeing people, not as symbols, not as problems to fix or icons to worship, but as human beings who might surprise you if you give them the chance. Even the ones who come to your house with sharp questions and hidden agendas." Daniel didn't say anything. He just sat there letting the words settle into his bones. Eastwood didn't press, didn't ask if he got it. He just stood, stretched slightly, and said, "Sun's getting low. You better head back before the fog rolls in." On the drive back, Daniel didn't turn on the radio. He let the silence fill the car, the same way it had filled the porch. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full, of respect, of humility, of a truth that didn't need to be shouted to be true. Back in his room, he opened his laptop again. This time the words came easily, not because he had all the answers, but because he'd finally stopped pretending he needed them. He wrote about the man, not the myth, about the quiet consistency that looked like stubbornness to some and integrity to others. About how one sentence, simple, unguarded, human, could unravel a whole story built on assumptions. He didn't know if his editor would like it. Didn't know if readers would care. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't write for them. He wrote because he'd been changed. And maybe, just maybe, someone else would be too. The hotel room felt different now. Not just a place to sleep between interviews, but a kind of sanctuary where everything Daniel thought he knew had quietly unraveled. He sat at the small desk by the window, the glow of his laptop the only light in the dim room. Outside, the Pacific whispered against the shore, steady and patient like it had all the time in the world. He wished he felt the same. He'd written most of the night. Not the piece he was sent to write, but something truer. Something that didn't try to pin Eastwood down like a specimen under glass, but instead followed the quiet thread of a life lived with consistency, not perfection. He described the porch, the soup, the way Eastwood listened like every word mattered, even the skeptical ones. And he included that sentence, not as a punchline, not as a mic drop moment, but as the quiet center of everything. "I've never met a person who didn't deserve a second look." Now, rereading it in the cold light of morning, he wasn't sure if it was journalism anymore. It felt too personal, too soft. His editor would call it indulgent. Maybe she'd be right. He made coffee from the machine in the corner, weak, bitter, nothing like the kind Eastwood brewed, and scrolled through his notes one last time. That's when he noticed something he'd missed before. Buried in an old industry newsletter from 2012 was a short mention. Eastwood had quietly funded a film workshop for at-risk teens in East LA. No press. No photos, just a line. Anonymous donor covers full program costs for 3 years. Daniel dug deeper, found a local teacher who confirmed it, said Eastwood never asked for credit, just wanted the kids to have a chance to tell their own stories. Then there was the veterans' shelter in Monterey. A small place, barely on the map. Daniel called the director, who laughed when he heard Eastwood's name. He shows up every Christmas Eve, she said. Brings groceries, stays for dinner, talks to everyone like they're old friends. Never lets us take his picture. And the actor, barely known, early 30s, who'd landed his first lead role in one of Eastwood's films after working as a parking attendant on set. He saw me reading a script between shifts, the actor told a podcast years ago. Next thing I knew, I was in a scene with him. Said he liked how I held myself, like I knew I belonged there even if no one else saw it yet. Daniel leaned back, stunned. None of this was secret exactly, but it wasn't promoted either. Eastwood wasn't building a brand. He was just living, helping where he could, creating space for others. And somehow, in all his research, Daniel had missed it. Or maybe he hadn't been looking for it. He'd been too busy hunting for contradictions to see the through line. A man who believed in people even when they didn't believe in themselves. That changed everything. He opened his draft again. This time he wove those quiet acts into the story, not as proof of sainthood but as evidence of a philosophy in action. The same belief that showed up in his films, in his silences, in that one sentence on the porch. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up again and again with your eyes open and your heart willing to be surprised. But now came the hard part, sending it in. He stared at the send button like it might bite him. His editor expected a takedown, or at least a probing critique. What he'd written was something else entirely. A reflection, a reckoning, maybe even an apology. Would she run it? Would anyone care? He took a breath and hit send. 2 hours later, his phone buzzed. Read it. Not what I asked for, but it's good. Really good. Let's talk. He exhaled, shoulders dropping for the first time in days. They spoke that afternoon. She didn't love everything. He could hear the hesitation in her voice when he mentioned the shelter, the workshop, but she admitted the piece had weight. It doesn't feel like you let him off the hook, she said. It feels like you finally saw him. That's the point, Daniel replied. They agreed to publish it as is with only minor edits. No sensational headline, no clickbait framing. Just the story as it happened. That night, Daniel walked down to the beach. The air was cool, the sand damp under his shoes. He thought about all the stories he'd written over the years, some sharp, some clever, a few even important. But none had cost him anything. None had asked him to change. This one had. It had forced him to admit he'd been wrong. Not just about Eastwood, but about how he saw the world, as a place of surfaces to scratch rather than depths to explore. He sat on a driftwood log and watched the waves roll in. Somewhere out there, Eastwood was probably editing footage or reading a script or fixing something around the house, not thinking about legacies or headlines, just doing the work, the way he always had. And Daniel realized something else. He didn't need Eastwood to read the piece. Didn't need thanks or validation. The change had already happened in him. He'd gone looking for a contradiction and found coherence instead. Not the kind that's neat or easy, but the kind that comes from living long enough to know that people are rarely just one thing. Back at the hotel, he opened a new document. Not for work, just for himself. He started writing about what it meant to listen, not just to record, but to hear. About how curiosity without judgment could open doors you didn't even know were closed. About how one sentence, spoken without fanfare, could echo louder than 1,000 arguments. He didn't know if he'd ever publish it, but he needed to say it. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't writing to prove something. He was writing to understand, and that, he thought, was where real stories began. The article went live on a Tuesday morning. No fanfare, no teaser campaign, just a quiet post on the magazine's website with a simple title. What I learned when I stopped trying to discredit Clint Eastwood. By noon, Daniel's inbox was full. Not with angry letters or editor complaints, but with messages from readers, some young, some old, many strangers, who said the piece made them pause. One wrote, "I've been judging my dad the same way you judged Eastwood. Maybe it's time I listened instead." Another said, Thank you for reminding me that people can be complicated and still worthy of respect. His editor called him that afternoon, voice lighter than he'd ever heard it. We're getting more traffic on this than anything we've published this year, she said, and not the usual hot take crowd. Real people. Thoughtful ones. Daniel didn't know how to respond. He hadn't written it for clicks or praise. He'd written it because he had to, because the truth he'd found wouldn't fit into the box he'd brought with him. A week later, the piece was shared by a film professor at NYU, then picked up by a podcast about storytelling, then quoted in a newsletter about aging in America. It wasn't going viral in the flashy sense. No memes, no outrage, but it was spreading in the quiet way real ideas do, from person to person, conversation to conversation. And then, one gray morning, a plain envelope arrived at his apartment. No return address, just his name and street in neat, slightly slanted handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. At the top, in the same hand, "Thanks for listening." Below it, a signature, simple, unembellished, unmistakable. Daniel held the note for a long time. He didn't show it to anyone, didn't post it online. He just tucked it into the back of his journal, next to his notes from that first day in Carmel. It wasn't about proof or bragging rights. It was a quiet acknowledgement between two people who'd met in the space between assumption and understanding. Months passed. Daniel kept writing, but something had shifted. He no longer chased the angle that would get the most reactions. He started asking softer questions. What matters to you? Instead of why are you wrong? He interviewed a retired teacher who'd started a community garden, a mechanic who wrote poetry in his spare time, a teenager who'd turned her grief into a nonprofit. His editor noticed. "You're writing like you care again," she said once, and he realized it was true. He still thought about that afternoon on the porch. Not just the sentence Eastwood had said, but the way he'd said it. With no expectation, no performance, just the calm certainty of someone who'd spent a lifetime watching people surprise themselves. That sentence became a kind of compass for Daniel. Before hitting send on a draft, before framing a question in an interview, he'd ask himself, am I giving this person a second look? Or am I just confirming what I already believe? It changed everything. One evening, while cleaning out an old drawer, he found the ticket stub from that Mystic River screening years ago, the one in the frame on his wall. He held it in his palm, remembering how that film had made him feel seen, even though he was just a kid with no idea what real pain looked like. Now he understood that's what Eastwood had always done. Not told people what to think, but created space for them to feel, to question, to sit with the messiness of being human. He didn't idolize Eastwood now. He didn't need to. What he felt was something deeper, gratitude. Not for the movies or the fame, but for the quiet example of a man who never confused being old with being irrelevant, who kept working not for applause, but because the work itself mattered. Years later, when Daniel gave a talk to journalism students, someone asked him, "What's the most important lesson you've learned?" He didn't talk about sources or structure or deadlines. He said, "Don't mistake your first impression for the whole story. People are almost always more than what you came to prove." After the talk, a student stayed behind. Did that really happen? The Eastwood piece? Daniel smiled. Every word. Do you think he knew what he was doing? Saying that one sentence? I don't think he was trying to do anything, Daniel said. He was just being honest. And sometimes honesty is the most powerful thing there is. Back home that night, he sat on his own small balcony, a cup of tea in hand, the city humming below. He thought about legacy, not the kind measured in awards or box office numbers, but in moments like that one on the porch. In notes passed quietly, in stories that help someone see the world or themselves a little differently. He never heard from Eastwood again. And he didn't need to. The conversation had already done its work. Sometimes late at night, when the world feels loud and divided, Daniel still hears those 10 words in his mind. Not as a quote to repeat, but as a reminder. Everyone deserves a second look, not because they're perfect, but because they're human. And in a time when so many stories are built on tearing people down, that simple truth feels more radical and more necessary than ever.